Thanks everyone for being here. This is Brandon, and we're going to do Scholar Talks. You may be familiar with it. You may not be familiar with it, but this is where we sit down just to have a long form conversation with a person that I have reached out to as a scholar of a certain text or an author. And I know sometimes people don't like that word. It makes them feel a little pretentious. It's my word, not necessarily their word, but they certainly know their stuff. And so today we have Dr. Tarshia Stanley, who's at St. Catherine's in Minnesota. I met her when she was at Spelman in Atlanta, and she's going to be leaving St. Catherine's for another position next year. But when I reached out to her, based on some of the previous work we had done, I knew that she would have something great to offer. And as a scholar of Octavia Butler herself, she recommended or asked if she could do Parable of the Sower. I mean, it was such a quick response, Tarshia. I don't even think you had to think about it. You're like, that's what I want to do, right? And so I'm so excited because I had read Butler before I met you, but I had not given time to Butler the way I needed to after I met you and after I heard you talk about her. And so revisiting this book was huge for me. And I think the next book I'm going to read is going to be something by N.K. Jemisin, because I've been reading about Jemisin, and then you mentioned Jemisin and something else you and I were doing last week. And so just a wonderful world here. And I do want to talk about at some point this term speculative fiction. I just wonder if it's just almost like a euphemism in a way, but we can get there. We can talk about it. But I want you to talk about yourself for a little bit, kind of tell us your background and how you ended up a scholar of Butler and why you chose this book.
Well, my background, I'm an English professor, but, my work is not just literary text, but also sort of film and media text. And so I come at the, literary scholarship in terms of textual work. And so it's really about what is a text in all of its forms and how do we read it? How do we understand it? And my own love of literature, really, I love all literature, but as a kid, I just really loved science fiction. I loved to get lost in worlds and think about space and the future. And I was a Trekkie before, people that was popular. I would come home every day after school and watch Star Trek, and Mr. Spock was my first crush because he made it, cool to be smart. And so I just loved all things science fiction. But I didn't discover Octavia Butler until I was in graduate school in the late 90s. And I just came across her book of short stories called Bloodchild. And I was mad because I thought, how did I not know that there was this African-American woman writing science fiction, while I was a younger person when I was growing up, that I had never heard of her. I knew about Virginia Hamilton, and who was writing what is termed young adult fiction and what was speculative fiction, some science fiction. And I actually did my master's thesis on Virginia Hamilton's work. And I started to read Octavia Butler, but I never did scholarship on Octavia Butler, and I never taught her as a college professor until about 2010. And that was after her untimely death in 2006. And I never taught her in the classroom because that was for me, that was the place I went to do my thinking and to do my recovery and to think about what it meant to be a human being and to really, sort of be myself in the world. Speculative fiction, science fiction was the place I did that. So I didn't really think about it in the context of my scholarly work until after she passed away. And as I began to think about what she meant in the world, I thought, why don't you teach her in the classroom? And it just so happened that, it was time for me to go on sabbatical in 2010. And I decided I would spend my sabbatical researching and writing Octavia Butler. And I got to do that. And then I realized that there were all these scholars in the academy who were using her work. And they weren't just in English classrooms, they weren't in literary classrooms, they were in economics classrooms, they were in history classrooms, political science, a biomedical ethics course. And I thought, my goodness, why aren't we talking to each other about this work, in the academy? And that's really how I then began to do work on Octavia Butler and really incorporated her into my classrooms and really began to introduce my students to her work.
So you and I had had discussions before about the the role of Butler and Butler's development, and I'll say slow acceptance by the Academy, whatever that really means. But talk to me about why you chose Parable of the Sower as the book for this talk and not some other book. A lot of people are familiar with other books of hers. So why Parable of the Sower?
Well, and then for people who were teaching her in their classrooms, most of them would use her work Kindred. So people were quite familiar with Kindred, those who did use Butler.
Yeah, and that's what we used. We used Kindred in the textbook that
right.
we put
Yeah,
out through
it's the most
PerfectionLearning.
accessible of her works because it's really used as a neo-slave narrative because people are most familiar. It has the least amount of sort of speculative fiction in the work, right? It's, people can access that pretty quickly. I think Parable of the Sower is really accessible in a way now for our times. I think that people, it just in 2020, it reached the New York Times bestseller list for the first time, even though it had been published in 1993. And I think it's because people see the world that she built in 1993, which people would read it back then and go, oh, this can never happen. But we're living in that world now, and they see themselves now, they see us now. And so it resonates now in a way that it didn't in 1993, even though I think that, she was recognized for the work. I think it's in many ways, that's the work that she won the MacArthur Fellowship for. But people who never would have picked it up before, pick it up now because it's so prescient, because they see it and they see us in it. And they go, wow, she saw what was going to happen if we continued on the path that we were on. And I think that for young people, I think it's important for them to read it because it's told through the eyes of a young person. And it's a young person who's trying to order herself in a chaotic world, one that's fallen apart, and that she gives good example for the ways in which you can collect yourself and collect your thoughts and think about what it means to survive when those things that you used to depend on are no longer there for you. So it gives people a touchstone and a way to connect.
Yeah, I was blown away as I was rereading it because I'd read it before, but like I said, I'd never given it the time that it needed. And as I was rereading it, sometimes, as you say, books have their moment, have their time. And I also believe that books have a time in our lives. Like, I read something as a high schooler, as a college student, and it didn't click. But I read it now as a parent, as a person of a certain age, and or in a certain moment, and something strikes me. And so I felt like that very much with this book. And I also couldn't help but think about other books so it's similar to it, not derivative in any way, but as I'm reading this, a book that's having its moment again now, probably because of the TV series, is The Handmaid's Tale. You can't avoid that. They're not the same world, but the similarities are stark, really. And I also thought about Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Again, not the same world. That's a post-apocalyptic. This is not that. But what other literature do you see doing the kind of work that a book like this is doing today?
I think in many ways, I think that the rereading of I think any literature at this particular point can be useful. I think those genres, I think all of the genres you just named are useful because they're the collapse of something. Right. So something that we've depended on because they're a reflection of our society at this point. We're going through metamorphosis. And those things that we used to take for granted or used to believe wholeheartedly, we're questioning truths.
And that's her God is change mantra throughout this.
Right. And so any literature, I think that questions truths, those things that we always thought to be true, is one that has a moment of renaissance right now. And so that whole rereading process is what we are doing in our society. So I think that any text is valuable at this moment for rereading if we're willing to reread it and see something differently and to acknowledge that it can be reread in a different way. And so I think just it's the rereading process that's so important at this moment. and that can be valuable for any text. And just to take a look at it and see, how do we reread it differently? Because I try to reread Parable every year. I don't always make it. Like, I haven't reread it in its entirety this year, but I read parts of it every year. But I used to really try to reread it every year to see, because I would change, and then the way it would resonate with me would change. And so I think it's a reflection of our society that we're having to reread ourselves, because we're questioning who we are and who we want to be. And there's so many things in the parable that reflect that back to us. You know, when we think about Lauren's, they have their planet.
Lauren's being the main character, right?
Right. Yeah. Lauren being the main character in Parable of the Sower. I mean, when we talk about, you know, our relationship with the planet, right? Lauren, her family, her generation is living out the result of that. You know, with the wildfires in California. She's in California living out the result of that. And then when we look at last summer and we see what happened in California, my students, when we read this book together in 2020, and they were like, this is happening right now. I mean, it resonated with them in a way because they could actually see it. And so they're having to then think about their relationship with the planet in a different way. And it's real to them. It's not something we're speculating about. It's not something we're saying this could happen. It is happening. And so I think that any literature right now gives us an opportunity to reread it in a way, because we're actually having to experience those things.
Yeah, and I thought a lot about this. 1984 had its, I'm just going to say, resurgence. 1984 Brave New World had their resurgence, you know, in 2016 for different reasons on different sides of the political spectrum, because I'm convinced, especially 1984, it can be read in multiple directions of the political spectrum. But that's a different discussion for a different day. Those books are often labeled as dystopian. And I don't know, like, this is not post-apocalyptic, as I said earlier, I don't think. But I don't know if dystopian works either. And I know that that's a fraught kind of term. As a person who has studied this and thought a lot about it, what do you think about that?
Well, I think those terms, utopia, dystopia, and post-apocalyptic, you know, apocalypse, they're literary terms that want to frame literature in certain boxes, right? And they're useful for talking about certain kinds of literature, but no literature fits neatly in those boxes and those boxes only, right? There are terminologies that can be applied to books and to certain parts of books and to concepts in those books. But I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, it can only fit in that particular category. We can use that as a descriptor. And so for Butler, there are certain parts you can post-apocalyptic means that a particular society has collapsed. It is no more. And so there has been an apocalypse. And so for Lauren's elders, there has been an apocalypse, right? Yes. Because the society they live in does not exist anymore. Yep. And they're frozen in time, waiting for that to come back. And Lauren is saying to them, it's not going to come back. Now you have to figure out how to live in the world that we have now. And so for them, it has been a devastation and they're frozen. Right. And for the people who didn't survive that transition of the world, it was an apocalypse. Right. But when we think of apocalyptic literature, it's usually, you know, like a bomb has gone off and you know, and there's a wasteland. But when they get out on the road, the landscape has changed. There is no safety. So it is a type of wasteland. So I think that there are post-apocalyptic things about the novel. There are ways to describe it in that way, but it may not fit neatly in that category. And maybe we need to reframe how we see some of those categories when we're talking about the literature.
And as I was thinking about it and writing about it, it really struck me, and of course I invite your comment on this, it struck me that it might be dystopian only if you saw what they no longer had as utopian.
Right.
And then the idea that maybe, you know, is our utopia, you can't answer this, I don't expect you to. Well, maybe you know the answer. If you do, let us know. But is our utopia only realized in reflection? You know, or you know, I think there's a song from the 80s, you know, you only realize what you've got once it's gone. that idea. And I don't know. It was just that central conflict between Lauren and the people just a little bit older than her was something I noticed because of what you're talking about. It was,
Mhm.
I guess a weak analogy, trying to contemporize it, would be, the okay boomer moment, which is, not the exact same thing, but looking back saying, okay, you're not going to make America great again. This is what it has become.
Mhm.
And how are we going to continue living? What's our journey? And even before they got out on the road, I noticed that there was so much of the journey discussion
Mhm.
before they hit the road even. And so I kind of saw that as foreshadowing once it was there. So
Yeah, and I think, that whole idea of utopia, when you go back to look at the history of the writing of utopia, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, right?
oh yeah.
Because that whole concept of a perfect society was built on the bodies of people who, had to endure some kind of, they lack so that those people could have that perfect society. So there was never a perfect utopia in which everybody was equal, in which everybody had everything they needed. Somebody had to suffer so somebody else could have utopia. And so, so that whole idea of there was never, so make America great again was only great for a certain number of people,
Right.
for a small number of people. And so was utopia. And so even for the parents who are waiting for America to return to this place, or for their community to go back to the way it used to be, it was only that way because it had a wall around it, right? It wasn't that way for the people who were outside of the wall. And so I really love, I was talking to I like to go back and read Amanda Gorman's poem about her inaugural day address, because I always struggle with that, like I'm an educator, and I always keep thinking, how do we do this? What is broken about our educational system? How are we not getting all of our students? And I remember she said something in the poem about it's not that it was broken, it's that it was never finished. Right. Yeah. And so we just haven't gotten there yet. And it gave me so much hope that we never were there. We haven't gotten there yet. We never were great. We have to get to greatness, right? There was never a utopia. We haven't gotten there yet. Because if we don't gather everybody up along the way, we haven't arrived there yet. It's not for some people and not for other people. And so for Lauren and her group, as we think about Parable of the Sower, we can't get to greatness at the expense of the planet. We can't get to greatness at the expense of other people. And so for Lauren, that collapse is necessary because, we can't get to greatness with a certain number of people behind a wall. And so we have to figure out, so Acorn is where, Lauren and her, once the wall collapses and she and the survivors have to try to figure out how they're going to survive. They get on the road and they go, we have to rebuild our society. And they're trying to think about what that looks like, as every journey ends with us trying to rebuild society. Well, when you start over, you have to start thinking about, well, how does it look like so we include everybody? How do we get everyone in there? And so it's that quintessential trying to come to a place in which we can figure out how to all live together and keep everybody, whole, is that journey that she's on.
And so you mentioned something that I didn't quite know how to square as I was reading, because it's not a racial narrative, but clearly race and gender. It's not a gender narrative. And I know you have to be careful with those terms, but when I say it's not a racial narrative or a gender narrative, it's not built around a racial struggle or racial experience. It's not built around a gender struggle or gender experience, outside of the fact that it is a young Black female narrator. So we can't remove it from that. But occasionally race pops up and gender pops up. And I really thought it was interesting because it seemed much more like life, where you're living, you're getting by, you're abiding, and race and gender don't matter until they do. And then when they do, it's a big deal. And that seemed much so very realistic to me. Now I realize I'm saying that as a white male. My positionality matters there. Um, but how do you think about that as the narrative progresses? Am I missing it? Am I being a little bit too myopic in saying that those things don't matter until they do matter? What's going through your mind with that?
I think they don't matter until they do matter to other people. I think they always matter to Lauren inherently. I mean, she doesn't wake up every day thinking about herself as a woman or as a woman of color, because she just is. It's when other people insert those things into the narrative that it becomes something to, I think, at the center, because she just is those things. And her worldview is those things. It's when other people have to, try to subtract from that it becomes something that she has to think about. So for instance, even in her household, her hyper empathy syndrome is seen as something. Her father says, hide that, that's a weakness. Well, it actually is a strength for Lauren, because that is what makes her such a great leader. And in many ways, one of the ways that I teach the text is that, my students, we read the text looking for, I teach a course called Butler's Daughters, and we look for ways of leadership in the text. And is there something that we can learn from the text for in terms of leadership, that how women lead differently, perhaps, or that there are ways in which Lauren, as a woman, as a young woman leader, are there things we can learn from her that we don't necessarily think of traditionally as leadership, because she is young, because she is a woman, because she is a person of color? Are there things that we can learn from her leadership style that may not have been brought to the fore before or seen as strengths? And one of those things that we look at is her hyper empathy, because that's not something that's centered as a leadership strategy. That you are not supposed to be empathetic, that is quintessentially feminine, and therefore not, that leadership is traditionally masculine and charismatic and very strong, very loud. And Lauren doesn't lead that way. She's very collective, and let's get the group and let's talk about it. And she's such a strong leader because she must think about what everybody else feels, because if she doesn't, it puts her at a disadvantage. If she doesn't think about it, she can't pull the trigger, because if she does, she's going to hurt herself. So she has to think about what that means. And so we look for those kinds of things. And so we do think about all of the positionalities that she occupies, looking at them as strengths rather than as weaknesses.
Wonderful. There's just so much that we could keep going and unpack there. The book is so rich, just with the things we talked about, just with Lauren, that there's so much that could be done with it. Like when, I used to have conversations with my colleague and your colleague, David Miller, about, what is the difference between literature and the big L literature? Like what is it? And this is, I hate to say it, but it's kind of like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. I don't know for sure, but I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. This is it, because of how rich it is. I mean, I feel like I'm working for the publisher trying to sell it. But there's just so much here. I could teach an entire course just with this book and teach everything kids need to know. So, but with that said, what do people not know? This is one of the questions I like to ask of all the people who come here. What do people not know about the author or the text that they should know?
I think they should know that it's not, that it isn't just taught in English classrooms, right? So people think, oh, this is literature, I'm going to teach it in an English classroom, that it is so nuanced and that there's so much in it, that it is taught in so many different kinds of classrooms, that you can use it in so many different ways. As I said at the introduction, that what I found in the academy is that, people use it in an economics classroom, because you can, capitalism is at play in the text, right? Yeah. When you think about, politics, you can use it in your political science classroom, right? If you want to talk to students about what it means, the border wall is at play in 1993 in this text, right?
Well, I thought about, you say that about capitalism, when they started talking about, and we're allowed to do spoilers here. When they started talking about the company towns, You know,
Mhm.
I grew up
Yes.
in Appalachia, and I remember my
Mhm.
grandfather telling me about growing up in a town called Co-op, and it was called Co-op because it was supposed to be a cooperation between the coal company and these things are not far removed from my
Mhm.
generation and your generation. And so, yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I
Yeah,
love
and they're
that.
not new, right? This is not when you read about, the Lawrence friend and the family deciding we're going to go there it's neo-slavery, right? We're going to sell ourselves to this town. It's sharecropping, in the
Debt
21st
slavery, they called it,
century,
right?
right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's debt slavery. And that it's not new. It's just they're packaging it differently, but this is the same thing. And that people are being subjected to over and over and over again. And so for a high school person reading this today, for them, they're like, what is this? It has happened before and we're letting it happen again. And so helping students see that yes, it's the Bildungsroman, it's the coming of age narrative,
oh
but
yeah,
look at all the other things that are happening in the text that you can read here, that you can see here. It's also that, there's the opera, Toshi Regan does the opera on Parable of the Sower, and I had the privilege of bringing that to St. Catherine University. And I remember sitting in the audience and they're singing Parable of the Sower, and there's this song where Lauren is singing, "Has anybody seen my father?" And it was the first time that when I went back to reread the novel, that I paid specific attention to this relationship between this father and daughter. And I always knew that Lauren was just like her father. But when the actor is standing on the stage singing, "Has anybody seen my father?" when he doesn't return home after he leaves for work on the bicycle. And I thought, this is a girl whose father has gone missing. So it's those familial relationships as well. And just there's so much in the text. As you said, you
yeah,
could spend the entire semester
yeah.
teaching the text.
And there's so many different layers, and we say that a lot about literature, but what I
Mm-hmm.
mean when I say there's lots of layers here is there are lots of obvious things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when they're on the road and they meet Travis and Natividad, is that her name?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I saw that name, I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is obvious. They meet
Mm-hmm.
Natividad. She's got a baby named Dominic, which literally means, you know, owned by God. And
Mm-hmm.
her name is the Nativity. I'm like, okay, this is
Mm-hmm.
obvious to me as a literature person, maybe not to my students, but I
Mm-hmm.
could teach it on that level and the kids would be like, oh yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then the motif of fire throughout is
Mm-hmm.
both blatant, but also like an undercurrent
Mm-hmm.
of cleansing and even though it's terrible. And so there's layers like that that make it so rich too,
Mm-hmm.
that I think, like you said about her father returning to it, you know, I
Mm-hmm.
had not thought about her being like her father until you just said this. And of course, all the cylinders are firing on that now. What I
Because
kept,
Lauren's a pastor, right? She's a pastor.
yeah.
Like her father's a
And
pastor.
she's the
Lauren's
leader. She's the,
and she's
yeah.
the leader. So
Mm-hmm.
it's her father all over again, even though she fights so hard, like all young people do, not to be like their parents. She is her father.
Yeah. And I love, I mean, very simple line where, and this is where I used to do an activity with my students. I'd have them dig through a novel, and I still do it with my college students when I'm teaching lit. I'll have them dig through a novel and find a line. I give them 20, 30 minutes to spend with the novel, find a line. I said, we have to talk about this line or this sentence. And the
Mm-hmm.
one where she says she's anointing people to say in the town, you know, I'm gonna do Corey's job. They're gonna preach because they know their Bible. Like she's the judge. She's saying they know their
Mm-hmm.
Bible because she's the daughter of this preacher man. But what I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
get over that seemed obvious to me was that how much it talks about the man she ends up with being like her
Mm-hmm.
father.
Mm-hmm. And
And
is old enough to be her father.
yeah, and was old enough to be her father. And that really, but then how passionately Butler describes the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't get over that. And of course, the psychology of that, and you're thinking Oedipus or Electra or whatever you want to do with it. But
Mm-hmm.
why do you think? Why do why go that far? Why does she have to end up with this man who's so much like her father?
Well, I think there's always a twist in Butler's work. And there's always that twist in Butler's work, because she does it she does it in like in some of her other work too, where there's this very young character who ends up with someone who's much older, and it's quite disturbing for lots of folks who read her work, that she always has this kind of twist in her work. And so I don't know that I can explain it. I do think that there's a generational thing at play in Butler's work. I think she's always asking us to question how generations work together, how they come together. And sometimes she puts that together romantically, but I think she's always asking us to think about what that means for us in terms of our civilization. How do we work together? Because usually in these novels, usually in literature, those generations there always has to be a falling away of that older generation, so that, in the coming of age story, so that the younger generation can thrive. But she always has some deep connection between generations. And I think she's asking us to think about what that means. And particularly for Parable of the Sower, I think in order to look at Lauren and Bankole, I think is his name.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't remember his name either.
Yeah, I think
Bankole,
you have to go to the second book to look at their child. I think that's a question we have to answer when we look at Parable of the Talents, and really think about what that means later on, because I don't think it's fully developed in Parable of the Sower. And to remember that there was supposed to be a third book, Parable of the Trickster, which she never finished, because her work is so incredibly complex. And I don't know that she works that out either. I think we see it again when we get to Fledgling, her vampire novel. So her work is so complex that no one novel, I think, houses sort of what it is that she's doing. I think you have to look at the entirety of her work. But I think that there's something about generations, and something about what she's doing, and about her whole understanding of generations and her complex history with generations. Is that, because my work on Butler tells me that she was very wounded by her elders, and really thinking about what that means, and that she's always looking for answers about how to bring that to some conclusion, and that she's doing that through her characters in some way.
So I had not thought of it, the generational conflict I had seen, but thinking about it in the context even of Kindred, where it's a generational conflict 100 years ago, gap. It's not so different from the generational conflict that's overlapping that we get in this. So that's really something I'm going to need to think about and do some writing about, because I appreciate that a lot.
Oh yeah, I mean, I haven't even unpacked it, because I see it across the text, and even the fact that she does these serial texts, and that she takes you through generations, because you can see it in the Xenogenesis books. You see it that she goes generation to generation, and you have these conflicts amongst generations, that I think there's rich work there that she's doing, and showing us she doesn't end. We see generation after generation in these texts.
Yeah. Something else to think about, and another reason to return to the book for me, for sure. So something I always like to think about with these books, and talk to people who know them like this book, is because they're so rich, because there's so much there's usually something that's easy to miss or dismiss. So say, I don't understand why she's doing that, or not even think about it, just read past it because you're trying to grasp what else is going on. So what is that with this text? What's easy to miss? What's easy to dismiss? And why shouldn't we?
Well, I think it might be easy to miss the hope, and I hope people don't breeze past that. I think this text is so full of hope. And I think sometimes you can get bogged down with the trauma and that everyone's experiencing, and just don't forget that she writes these books because she believes deeply in humanity and our ability to get it right. And that's why she's writing, because she wants us to get it right.
And that brings me back to the comment you made, that things are always, it's not that it's broken, but it's never been finished, paraphrasing Amanda Gorman. And, it made me think about, I think it was Heraclitus. nothing is, everything is becoming.
Mhm.
You know, and this idea that things are going to change, and that God is changed. That's the earth seed
Mhm.
point
Mhm.
here. And so I really appreciate that. And I wonder how that comes back to this idea of thinking about this as a dystopian or a post-apocalyptic, because you know, the role of hope in a world like that matters significantly.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. I mean, that really helps me contextualize things a little differently as I return to it. So, all right. So a couple of things I want to ask you about. So you've used this term, and I've heard it before, and other people may have heard it before. Listen to this: speculative fiction.
Mhm.
So, is that just an academic term for science fiction? I mean, is it? It almost sounds euphemistic to me. Like we can't say we study science fiction, so we're going to say it's speculative fiction. You know, I'm sure it's more complicated than that. Help me out.
It's just an umbrella term for all the different genres. So science fiction technically is that speculative fiction that is scientific. There's always like a scientific explanation for what is happening. So it has lots of technology in it, as opposed to fantasy, so that it's a fantastical world, um, as opposed to horror, where it's just horrible and there's something, demonic about what's happening. But speculative fiction is the umbrella under which all those other terms fit. So, for instance, Octavia Butler does a lot of there are not a lot of it's not a lot of spaceships or a lot of robots or that kind of thing. We sort of think of those things as science fiction, right? But speculative fiction is another world, and you don't necessarily have to explain why it exists, or you don't have to have terminology, or you don't have to have a reason, or there isn't a scientific explanation. But it is the world that you can speculate about the reality of it. So it's just that big umbrella term under which all of that fits. But Octavia Butler did an incredible amount of research. Her work is not fantasy, in that there are laws holding it together. And she did a lot of research as to help us understand why what is happening in her world. So, for instance, my favorite short story of hers, called Bloodchild, she did all this research on leeches, and to think about, because it's the story of this work is very, and if you want to start with young people on her work, I think Bloodchild is a great story to start with. Story of this, society in which humans have gone to another planet. They had to figure out how to live with the species on that planet, and in exchange for living with them, that species deposits their young in human bodies, and human bodies then deliver the species for them. And so she had to do a lot of research to figure out, how can a human body be a host to a foreign species? So she had to look at how would a leech use a human body, and those kinds of things. So she did incredible amounts of research so that she could really know what she was talking about and build those worlds. And so speculative is just that literary term that encompasses those things that you're talking about. But people use it interchangeably with science fiction, but it's just, if you want to get technical in terms of when you're talking about science fiction. So Asimov would be more science fiction.
Yes, I understand that, and I appreciate the line. You've admitted to me that you were an old school Trekkie, and and I was too. I was a new generation Trekkie, but I don't know if you noticed when you told me that, though. You said you were a Trekkie before it was cool, and I'm like, is it ever cool, Tarshia? In my circle, it's cool, but I would never have called myself cool, right? So that's great. So I want to talk a little bit just about some things that I picked up on as I was reading, and I'd love to know your thoughts with this kind of stuff. So the phrase that caught me the most, the one that just, and I'm putting you on the spot. I want everybody listening or watching this to realize that you and I have not had a conversation about this ahead of time.
No.
But I could not get out of my head once I read it. And it almost brings tears when I was thinking about it, this phrase, because and now that you've said this about hope, this is it, where she says, life alone is enough, period. And that just captured everything for me. Like, to be alive is enough. To still be here, regardless of how badly things are, how badly things are happening around me, I'm still alive. And it's not part of Earthseed. It doesn't seem. It's just her commenting on, we're here. So I don't know if anything comes to mind for you. That's me, but I didn't know if anything comes to mind for you with that.
I just think that's the building block, right? As long as you're breathing, you have an obligation to build on that.
And then the other thing, about her hyper empathy, and we talked about, what that means. And, we talked about this as speculative fiction, science fiction. It seemed like there were points where it wasn't magic. Maybe, I don't know. I think it might be interesting to think of it as a recognition that empathy matters. Kind of what you were saying earlier about her role as a leader and things. And so that helped me think about that a little bit more. But then I also couldn't get this idea of magical realism, which I assume falls under speculative fiction too. Is that right? That this is not science fiction. It's more magical realism in a way. And I know I'm not trying to put things in boxes like that, but when you hear that term magical realism, thinking about this book, what comes to mind? Anything?
Well, I think it's that term, that was the term people used, I think, before we kind of opened up and let speculative fiction be in the space, and so for me, magical realism, it has its place, but it's a little more limiting. Okay. And that, that was kind of the acceptable term before we kind of allowed speculative fiction to be a genre and to be a place in which we sort of embraced it a little bit more widely in the academy. And and remember, now embracing in the academy means the 70s, right? I mean, so it's a long time. And so it isn't recent. It's been a long time that we've been embracing this in the academy. But I think that, but particularly for people of color, to bring Butler's work into the classroom has been, a little more recently outside of Kindred. Kindred has been in the classroom for a long time. So I just think we don't have to fall back on just magical realism. I think a lot of Toni Morrison's work has been described as magical realism, but I also think that, as I said, Virginia Hamilton, who a lot of people don't know, or who sort of qualify her work as just young adult fiction, I think they were doing this work at the same time as Morrison. And so were a lot of other people. When I look at, work in the late 19th century, early 20th century by African-American writers, which is what I know more so than other work, I look at the work that they were doing, and I think of some of that work as speculative fiction rather than just magical realism, which are just magical elements or folklore or those kind of things. Yeah. I think they were building speculative worlds, and they were allowing a different kind of reality to come into play. And so for me specifically, I think of magical realism as a more limiting term rather than speculative fiction, which gives us a broader space to play.
I'm so glad that I asked you that, because you have just helped me understand the relationship between all of these things that I saw as overlapping. Because,
well, that's just me though. I mean, somebody else would give you, a different answer.
Sure. Yeah, there's no 100%, but thinking about the history and the way things in the academy have developed, when you're going through school, it depends on who you got, who you're reading, and things like that. And so this just helps me contextualize that even better. So in the last few minutes we've got, I always like to ask, what you're reading or writing or researching now. I will tell everyone that the book that I don't have my copy of it right now because it's in my car. But my editor, who is also a friend of mine, has become a friend of mine, turned me onto this book, and I'm rereading it because I read it the first time. And if you've not read it, that's fine. I'm just sharing with everyone, but it's a translation from a Japanese novel by Koshikazu Kawaguchi, and it's called Before the Coffee Gets Cold. And it's about a little cafe in Tokyo, and in this one chair, you can go back in time. But once you're back in time, you can't leave the chair. And you have to and you have to return. You have to drink the coffee to return before it gets cold, or you get stuck. And it's a really neat novel, and it was really interesting. But I'm rereading it now because of this. And I thought, okay, I got to go back. And so I encourage everyone to check that out. It's called Before the Coffee Gets Cold. It's a tiny little novel. And now I think I'm going to go check out Virginia Hamilton based upon what you've said. But what are you reading now, Tarshia, or what are you researching or writing about?
Well, I have, I love science fiction. So right now I'm reading an author named Brandon Sanderson. And Brandon Sanderson is this incredibly prolific science fiction author who is such a world builder. And he actually was commissioned to finish A Wheel in Time, that series when the author passed away. Yeah. And so he has a series of books, and I'm finishing his series called Oathbringer. And so it's just he every book is 1,000 pages. Like, I just don't know how he does it. I'm like, how does he write like this? He just turns out so many things, but he builds all these worlds and he has all these series, and at some point they're all going to converge into a universe, so it's just amazing. But he's just Brandon Sanderson. He just does like I just think, how does he write like that? So,
right. Yeah. It's amazing how some of these authors are clearly in their heads. They're living in these worlds they're creating. Else they couldn't create all this content. It's amazing what they do.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for agreeing to talk here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And I'll kind of follow up with you and of course be in touch. And again, congratulations on your life moves and everything. I hope all those go well. And I'll be in touch.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.